The sun had long dipped behind the buildings, casting long shadows across the narrow street. The city, always in motion, had quieted for the night. Yet, beneath the calmness, there was an underlying tension, a subtle discomfort that lingered in the air. It was a feeling that one could not quite place, but could not ignore either. It wasn't loud, but it was felt in the spaces between people's words, in the way they avoided eye contact, in the way the community seemed to be living side by side, without ever truly connecting. In a small neighborhood, two families lived next to each other, yet, despite the proximity, they were worlds apart. The first family was everything. The second was not orderly, routine-driven, deeply rooted in tradition. The father was a man of strict habits, a man who believed in structure, in doing things the right way, even if it meant sacrificing personal freedom for the sake of order. The mother mirrored his steadfastness, her days defined by a rhythm she never questioned. Their children, too, were shaped by the structure of their lives, polite, well-behaved, and diligent. Next door, the second family lived in a much different world. Their home was filled with laughter and chaos, a sense of freedom that spilled into the streets. The father of this family was a man of few rules, believing more in allowing his children to learn from their own experiences than from any set of instructions. He saw life as something to be lived in the moment, each day a new adventure. His wife shared his views, though perhaps a bit more pragmatic. She also embraced the Misunderstandings of life. Their children were loud, spirited, and full of curiosity, always finding new ways to break away from the expected and explore the unknown. The contrast between these two families was stark. The first family was structured, their lives neat and predictable. To the first family, the second's carefree attitude seemed reckless and irresponsible. To the second family, the first's strict ways felt stifling, a cage built of rules that didn't allow for freedom or creativity. Both families, though they shared a common fence, were separated by invisible walls made of judgments, assumptions, and misunderstandings. On one particularly crisp evening, as the first family sat down to a quiet dinner, their conversations were polite but filled with the unspoken weight of routine. The mother cleared the table as the father read the newspaper, and the children sat, quietly finishing their meals. The atmosphere was calm but sterile, like a clock that ticked without ever pausing. Next door, the second family was gathered in the kitchen, the sounds of clattering dishes and laughter filling the air. The children ran through the house, shouting and playing, while the parents exchanged amused glances. Their home was messy, papers strewn across tables, shoes left haphazardly by the door, but the warmth that radiated from it was undeniable. There was no rush, no schedule to follow, just the present moment unfolding as it would across the shared fence. Each family went about their evening, each one unaware of the subtle divide growing between them, a divide formed not by walls, but by perceptions and misunderstandings. The first family could not understand the second's lack of order, and the second family could not comprehend the rigidity that governed the first's life. This unspoken tension, this divide, was a quiet one, growing in the spaces between them. Neither family fully understood the other, but both felt the other's presence as an obstacle to the life they each believed was the only way to live. Neither could see past their own beliefs, and so they lived side by side, never truly connecting. never truly knowing the other. And so the days passed, each one much like the last, with the tension of this invisible barrier slowly building. Neither family knew it yet, but this quiet, simmering conflict was about to be tested. The walls, though invisible, were stronger than they appeared, and it would take something more than words to break them down. It would take time, patience, and the willingness to see each other as more than just neighbors. But for now, all they could see was what they wanted to believe about the other. As the weeks passed, the lives of the two families continued to unfold in their respective corners, each family locked in its own world, unaware of how the small, unspoken judgments between them were beginning to deepen. The first family, with their neatness and order, continued their structured routine, while the second family, with their easygoing ways, continued to embrace the chaos of living freely. And though they shared a fence, their hearts remained distant, built by assumptions and misunderstandings that neither had yet taken the time to address. One afternoon, as the children of both families played outside, the quiet tension between the families grew even more apparent. The first family's children played in their garden, their movements careful and deliberate. They had been taught to stay within the boundaries, to respect the lines drawn by the adults. They made sure their toys were neatly put away at the end of the day, and their games were always structured and rule-based next door. The second family's children ran wild, their laughter echoing through the air. They climbed trees, picked flowers, and made up games that had no rules other than the ones they created in the moment. There was an undeniable joy in their freedom, but it also created a kind of disarray. The yard was filled with scattered toys, overturned flower pots, and shoes left in haphazard piles. The parents of the first family watched from their window, their expressions tight with discomfort, just beyond their own garden. The first family's mother, a woman who prided herself on her discipline and order, looked at the children next door with a mix of concern and judgment. She didn't understand why the second family allowed their children to behave in such an undisciplined manner. To her, it seemed reckless, as though the parents didn't care about teaching their children the importance of responsibility. She turned away from the window, shaking her head in quiet disapproval. Meanwhile, in the second family's home, the mother of that household smiled as she watched her children play. There was a freedom in their movement that she cherished, a spontaneity that felt like life at its most genuine. She believed in letting them experience the world for themselves, to learn from their own actions, and she didn't see the need to enforce the rigid structure that others seemed to thrive on. She'd always thought of the world as a place to explore, not a set of rules to follow. And so, when her children ran across the yard, their laughter filled with the joy of discovery, she could only smile and feel a deep sense of satisfaction. But in the quiet of her heart, there was also a small, nagging thought. She couldn't quite shake the feeling that the first family looked at them with something close to disdain. She had caught the way their eyes flicked over her children's messy play and the disarray in the yard. She hadn't said anything, of course, but she had noticed, and though she had no intention of changing the way she raised her children, she wondered if they had noticed her, too. She wondered if they saw her as a poor mother, one who had no control over her children, who allowed them to do whatever they pleased without teaching them boundaries. That night, after dinner, both families went about their usual routines. The first family sat at the dinner table, eating in silence as the mother cleared the plates, her mind still lingering on the image of the second family's chaotic garden. The father read his newspaper, occasionally commenting on a headline, but there was an underlying tension in the air. Neither of them spoke about the neighbor's yard, but both were thinking about it, both wondering what it meant about the other. Meanwhile, the second family sat together in their living room. The children sprawled on the floor with books, their feet sticking out as they laughed at something one of them had read aloud. The parents exchanged a look, a silent understanding that while their lives were different from the first family's, they were not to be judged by the standards of others. And yet, in the quiet moments before bed, the mother found herself wondering about the way the first family viewed them. She couldn't deny that a small part of her was affected by the way their neighbors. Disapproval lingered in her mind. The divide between the two families remained, unspoken but ever present. Neither family dared to voice the judgments they held of the other, but those judgments were shaping the way they moved through their world. It was a subtle thing, but it was there an invisible wall that separated them, keeping them from seeing the humanity in each other. The first family could not understand the second's carefree ways, and the second family could not understand the first's rigidity. And so, they continued their lives in parallel, each family carrying the weight of their assumptions, each family staying in their own corner, unwilling to reach across the divide. The tension, though quiet, continued to build. The distance between them, once a small crack, had now become a rift. Neither family had realized how far apart they had grown, and neither knew yet how their assumptions would ultimately shape the course of their relationship. But what was clear was that change was coming slowly, quietly, and perhaps when they least expected it. The seasons began to shift, and with them, something subtle began to change in the air. The first family's routine, once so tightly bound to the ticking clock of tradition, began to feel a little more mechanical, a little more rigid. The second family, too, continued their free-spirited ways, but a quiet unrest began to settle in the mother's heart. There was no open conflict between the families, no dramatic falling out, but there was an undeniable tension that stretched between them like an invisible thread, tugging at each of them in different directions. One rainy afternoon, the storm clouds rolled in with unexpected force, and a downpour flooded the streets. The sky turned a deep shade of gray, and the wind howled as the rain came down in sheets. The first family sat indoors, huddled by the warmth of the fireplace, listening to the rain hammer against the windows. The father, his brow furrowed, sat reading the newspaper, while the children played quietly at the table, finishing their homework. It was all very normal, very predictable, yet there was something in the air that felt different. The steady rhythm of their lives had been disrupted not by anything external, but by the sense of tension that clung to the house like the storm outside. Meanwhile, across the street, the second family was struggling to contain the chaos. The storm had created the wind, had knocked over the garden shed, and water was quickly pooling in their yard. The children, not accustomed to the idea of a proper cleanup, dashed around in the pouring rain, barefoot, laughing, and trying to salvage whatever they could from the flooded yard. The mother, drenched but determined, rushed outside to help them, her hands moving quickly, trying to organize the mess that seemed to grow with every passing minute. It was in the midst of this chaos that the first family noticed something they hadn't before: the vulnerability of their neighbors. They stood at their window, watching as the second family scrambled to salvage their belongings, their laughter still rising above the sound of the storm. It was the first time the first family had truly looked at them not with judgment, but with a quiet sense of concern. The storm had brought out something human in them, something that reached beyond the differences of their lifestyles. The father of the first family, who had never spoken more than a few words to the second family, suddenly felt an urge to help. It wasn't a grand gesture. It wasn't something he could rationalize. But standing at the window, seeing the second family working together, unbothered by the mess and chaos, he felt something stir within him. Without a word, he stood up from the couch, walked to the door, and put on his raincoat. His wife glanced at him, surprised, but said nothing. The children, too, were silent, watching their father as he stepped outside into the pouring rain. He crossed the street to the second family's yard, where the mother was still trying to collect the scattered belongings. "Do you need some help?" he asked, his voice steady but softer than usual. The second family's mother looked up, surprised, to see him standing there, wet and soaked through. But she quickly smiled, as if relieved. "I could use a hand, yes," she said, her voice almost lost in the sound of the rain. For the next hour, the two families worked together, one side offering the strength of organization and structure, the other bringing energy, resilience, and the ability to adapt in the face of chaos. The father from the first family set about organizing the mess, gathering loose items, while the mother of the second family showed him how to make the best of what they had. The children from both families joined in, their differences forgotten as they worked side by side. The rain fell harder, but no one seemed to notice. There was something different in the air now, something warmer that hadn't been there before. In their shared efforts, something was beginning to change. The walls between them were starting to crack, bit by bit. By the time the storm had passed, the yard was cleaned up. It wasn't perfect. There were still puddles. The shed was a little worse for wear, but the work was done, and the sense of accomplishment was mutual. The families stood together, catching their breath, their clothes soaked through, but their faces lighter, brighter. "Thank you," the second family's mother said to the first family's father, her voice sincere. The father nodded, though he wasn't sure how to express the strange sense of connection he now felt. He looked at the yard, then at her, and smiled softly. "It wasn't much, but it's good to know we can help each other," the second family's father, who had stood silently by the side, added with a quiet laugh, "Well, I'll admit I'm surprised. You've got a little chaos in you, after all." The comment hung in the air for a moment, but there was no sting in it, only warmth, a teasing kind of warmth that softened the barriers between them. The first family's father chuckled, his shoulders relaxing. "Maybe there's a bit more chaos in me than I thought." They stood together for a moment, the storm now gone, the air fresh and clear. For the first time in a long while, the two families saw each other for who they truly weren't, just neighbors, not just people with different lives, but people with shared experiences, with moments of connection. In that brief exchange, something had shifted, small but significant change, as if the storm had cleared not just the yard, but their hearts as well. "Thank you for the help," the first family's mother said, coming over to join the group. "Maybe we've misunderstood each other." The second family's mother smiled, nodding. "Maybe we all have." The evening began to settle in, the city quieter now as the storm's remnants faded. And in the quiet that followed, a new understanding had begun to take root, a realization that despite their differences, despite their judgments, there was room for connection, room for cooperation, room for shared understanding. The divide was still there, but it felt smaller now, less significant. The two families didn't know it yet, but this shared moment of help, of understanding, was the beginning of something new, something soft, something real. And as they said their goodbyes, walking back to their homes, they each carried with them the memory of the shared effort, of the bridge that had been built not with grand gestures or powerful words, but with simple acts of kindness, of reaching out across the divide. The days following the storm were quieter, but there was a subtle shift in the air. The once unspoken divide between the two families felt less pronounced. There was still an invisible line drawn between them, but now it seemed as though the edges of that line were beginning to blur, softened by the shared experience of the storm. Neither family had yet fully acknowledged the change that had begun to take place, but it lingered like the calm after a storm, quiet, still, and full of possibility. In the first family's home, the atmosphere was subtly different. There was a new ease in the way they interacted with each other. The father, once so focused on maintaining order, now lingered a little longer at the dinner table, listening to the children's stories with a new attentiveness. The children, too, seemed more relaxed, their movements less rigid, as if they had absorbed something of the freedom they had witnessed next door. Even the mother, usually so absorbed in her tasks, found herself pausing more often, taking in the sounds of her family with a sense of gratitude she hadn't fully realized was missing. On the other side, the second family also felt a quiet change. There was a new level of respect between them. The mother, who had always been the heart of the home, now noticed the subtle shifts in the way her family operated. Her children had picked up on the orderliness that had been brought into their home, not as a restriction, but as a gentle structure that allowed their spontaneity to flow more freely. The father, too, had started to recognize the importance of routine, though he would never admit it outright. The balance between freedom and order was delicate, but now it seemed more attainable than it ever had before. One evening, as the sun began to dip below the horizon, the two families found themselves once again in the quiet, shared space of the street. It wasn't planned. It wasn't something either family had set out to do, but there they were, standing together, the familiar fence between them now seeming more like a boundary to be crossed, rather than a wall to be kept intact. The first family's father, hesitant at first, stepped toward the second family's father. There was a brief pause, a quiet moment of uncertainty, before the two men exchanged a look, a glance that said everything their words hadn't. With a simple nod, the first family's father offered, "I was thinking, it might be nice to get the kids together this weekend. A picnic, maybe, just to spend some time." The second family's father looked at him for a moment, as if weighing the offer, and then nodded, a smile creeping onto his face. "That sounds like a good idea. The kids would love it." The two families exchanged a few more words, nothing groundbreaking, but enough to bridge the gap. The mother of the second family offered a soft, "We could bring some food, if you'd like." And the first family's mother smiled, a genuine smile, and agreed. The small act of reaching out, of inviting the other into their world, was more than just a friendly gesture. It was a quiet declaration that they were ready to begin again this time, with a deeper understanding of each other. The next weekend, the two families gathered at the park. The day was perfect, clear sky, a gentle breeze, and the warmth of the sun just enough to create a soft glow around the scene. The children ran around, their laughter ringing in the air, and for the first time, the two families saw each other. Not through the lens of judgment, but through the lens of shared humanity. They were not just neighbors. They were people who had made mistakes, who had misunderstood each other, but who had also learned, grown, and were now walking the same path together. The picnic was simple: sandwiches, fruit, and lemonade, but the simplicity of it made it all the more meaningful. There were no expectations, no need to impress or to adhere to some rigid ideal, just a shared meal, shared stories, and the kind of quiet companionship that only comes when walls come down. As the day drew to a close and the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the grass, both families sat together, content, in a way they hadn't been before. The children, tired from running and playing, nestled into their parents' arms, their faces flushed with the joy of the day. The parents, too, felt a new kind of peace. There was no need for words, now just the simple, quiet understanding that had emerged from their time together. As they packed up, ready to return to their homes, there was a sense of something unspokener, feeling that the divide that had once seemed so insurmountable was no longer a barrier. The journey was far from over, but they had taken the first step together, and that was enough. The laughter and warmth of the picnic would remain in their hearts, a quiet reminder that understanding, though difficult to reach, was possible. And as they said their goodbyes and walked back to their homes, they did so with a newfound sense of connection. The walls between them now little more than a distant memory. As the weeks unfolded, the once defined boundaries between the two families began to soften in the gentle rhythm of their newfound connection. The picnic, a simple gathering of shared space and stories, had acted as a catalyst, something so small, yet so meaningful. The morning after, as the sunlight streamed through the windows of each family's home, there was a subtle shift in the air. It wasn't loud or grand. It was quieter than that, like a seed planted in the soil, slowly taking root and growing. For the first family, there was a change in how they moved through their daily routine. The father, who had once been rigid in his expectations and habits, found himself lingering at the dinner table a little longer, listening intently to the children's chatter, allowing the conversation to flow freely rather than guiding it with his usual firm hand. The mother, who had been so caught up in keeping everything in perfect order, now found herself relaxing into the chaos of everyday life with a newfound acceptance. She noticed the laughter of the children louder, more vibrant, and, though it sometimes felt overwhelming, it also felt full of life, of something she hadn't allowed herself to experience for a long time. In the second family's home, there was a similar shift. The parents, once so accustomed to their freewheeling, sometimes disorganized routine, began to see the value in small doses of structure. The mother of the second family, who had always seen the world as something to be explored without constraints, now found herself making small adjustments, setting routines for the children, making sure the house didn't slip too far into chaos, but without sacrificing the freedom that made their home feel so alive. The father, who had always resisted routine, found himself taking moments to reflect on the structure that that had helped the first family thrive. He began to understand that structure didn't stifle creativity. It supported it in its own way. And so, in the quiet spaces between their old ways and new, the two families found themselves learning from one another. The rigidity of the first family softened in the warmth of the second's free-spiritedness, while the spontaneity of the second family found balance in the order of the first. They began to find a rhythm, not dictated by strict rules or free-for-all chaos, but by mutual respect for each other's differences and a willingness to meet somewhere in the middle. The families began to share more than just the occasional picnic. Small acts of kindness once rare between them became a part of their daily lives. The second family's children, who had once been hesitant to play in the yard of their neighbors, now felt comfortable running through the first family's garden, laughing and shouting with abandon. The first family's children, who had once stayed away from the Misunderstandings of life, now joined in the games, their laughter ringing out in unison with the second family's. It wasn't perfect. There were still differences, still moments of discomfort, but there was something new in the air, an understanding, a bond that had begun to form. The parents exchanged smiles more often now, their conversations flowing with ease. The first family's father, once so guarded and skeptical, now found himself chatting with the second family's father about life, family, and the small things that made them happy. The second family's mother, who had once been so quick to judge the first family's rigid ways, now found herself appreciating the order that came with their approach to life. She could see the beauty in the way they structured their days, in the way they made time for each other, in the quiet spaces between work and routine. There was still work to be done, of course. There were still moments of misunderstanding, still times when old habits resurfaced. But the connection between the two families was growing stronger with each passing day. They had begun to bridge the divide between them, not by changing each other, but by accepting each other's differences and learning from them. One evening, as the sun dipped low and the cool evening air began to settle over the city, the two families gathered once again, not for a grand occasion, but for a simple evening together in the garden. There were no expectations, no formalities, just the quiet peace of shared space. The children played, the adults talked, and for a while there was nothing but the sound of laughter and conversation, of two families coming together in ways they had never imagined. As the stars began to appear in the night sky, the families stood side by side, looking up at the vastness above them. The evening was still, the world quiet, and in that moment, it felt as though all the differences that had once divided them had melted away, leaving behind only the shared beauty of the night and the warmth of connection between them. In that stillness, you realized that the divide wasn't just a wall to be broken, it was a bridge to be built, slowly, one small step at a time. And the first step had been taken not by grand gestures, but by simple, quiet moments of understanding, by the willingness to listen, to change, and to embrace each other, just as they were. And though their journey was far from over, this moment felt like a new beginning, one that was full of potential, full of the quiet beauty that exists when we take the time to truly see one another. As the seasons shifted once more, the warmth between the two families seemed to deepen, subtle but undeniable. The once awkward exchanges had evolved into genuine conversations, the hesitant glances into open smiles. What had begun as a shared moment of necessity, a brief rainy day spent working side by side had transformed into something more lasting. The walls that had stood between them, invisible yet impenetrable, had begun to crumble under the weight of shared experience, of mutual respect. But the journey was not without its struggles. Beneath the calm exterior of their new, developing relationship, there remained old habits, old judgments that could flare up when least expected. A misunderstanding here, a slip of the tongue, their reminder that change, though steady, was never immediate. Yet, in the face of these small challenges, both families felt something shift within them. The willingness to engage, to break the silence with a question or a shared thought began to overshadow the discomfort of past misunderstandings. One evening, as the first family sat down for dinner, the conversation felt different than usual. The children, once quietly obedient to their parents' rhythms, now felt freer to express their thoughts, to speak their minds. The father, usually so set in his ways, found himself listening, not with the intent to correct, but with the intent to understand. The mother, once so caught up in the logistics of their lives, now found herself enjoying the small, meandering conversations that drifted from topic to topic. It was as though, by allowing themselves to soften, they had found a deeper connection to one another, not just as parents and children, but as people with individual thoughts and desires. Meanwhile, the second family, too, had felt the subtle shift. The mother, who had once been so resistant to the idea of boundaries, now recognized the comfort in a little structure, though still balanced with the freedom she cherished. She began to see that there could be a place for both order and spontaneity, a way to weave them together without stifling the very essence of their family's spirit. Her husband, who had always resisted structure, began to enjoy the predictability of shared routines, the quiet rhythm it brought to their day. It wasn't about changing who they were, but about finding a balanced one that allowed them to honor both freedom and the sense of security that order could provide. The children, too, reflected these changes. The once loud, carefree energy of the second family now had moments of quiet concentration, while the children of the first family began to embrace a new sense of adventure. They still enjoyed their structured games and activities, but there was a spark in their eyes, a hint of the spontaneous joy they had seen in their neighbors. The laughter that filled the air between the two families no longer felt forced or uncomfortable. It felt natural, as if they had always been meant to laugh together, to share this space. In the weeks that followed, the families continued to share more moments together. Sometimes it was a simple cup of tea in the quiet of the evening. Other times it was a shared meal or a walk through the neighborhood. These small, simple acts, once unfamiliar, had become the foundation of something deeper. It was in these moments, the quiet exchanges, that they began to see each other as more than just neighbors. They were people with hopes, fears, and dreams, not so different after all. One afternoon, as the sun set and painted the sky in hues of orange and pink, the two families sat together in the park. The children were playing nearby, their voices carrying in the wind, while the parents sat in a circle on the grass, the distance between them now almost imperceptible. The conversation ebbed and flowed, easy and relaxed. The father of the first family spoke of his work, his voice filled with passion as he described the projects he was working on. The second family's mother, once so hesitant to speak of her own aspirations, found herself sharing her thoughts on the changes she had made in their home, how she had begun to balance the spontaneous with the structured, and as they spoke, it became clear that they were no longer simply two families living next to each other. They were becoming a community. The gaps between their lives, once so wide, now felt smaller, filled with shared experiences, mutual respect, and understanding. The walls that had once separated them had been replaced with something more lasting: connection. As the evening deepened and the children's laughter faded into the night, both families sat in comfortable silence, a silence that was no longer heavy with judgment or unspoken words. It was a silence filled with the warmth of acceptance, of knowing that, though their lives were different, they had found something beautiful in their shared space. The city around them buzzed with its usual energy, but here, in this small corner, there was only peace, only the quiet sound of people who had learned to see each other for who they truly were. And as the night settled in, with the soft glow of streetlights casting long shadows across the park, both families realized that this moment was the beginning of something new, something that wasn't defined by differences, but by the shared humanity that connected them all. The divide, once so sharp, had softened into a bridge, and they had crossed it together, one small step at a time. The weeks that followed were quieter, but filled with small, meaningful changes. The rhythms of life for both families had shifted, imperceptibly at first, but now more firmly established. Their interactions, once strained and awkward, now felt natural. The occasional pauses and silences that had once been filled with discomfort had become moments of reflection, where each family could sense the changes they were undergoing together. It wasn't perfect. There were still misunderstandings and moments of hesitation, but there was a newfound sense of understanding, a shared commitment to bridging the divide. The first family, once so entrenched in their rigid routines, began to adapt. They allowed more flexibility in their days, welcoming moments of spontaneity that had once felt like an intrusion. The children played together more freely, no longer bound by the careful structure that had defined their activities. The mother found herself laughing more, not just at the children's antics, but at the moments of pure joy that came with letting go of the need to control every detail. The father, still grounded in his sense of order, began to embrace the unpredictability of life, recognizing that there was room for both structure and freedom in their family's world. Across the street, the second family, too, found themselves changing. The freedom they had so valued remained, but it was now tempered with a new appreciation for structure. The mother began to organize her days with more intention, finding balance between the spontaneous and the structured. She created routines for the children that provided them with stability, but she also allowed room for the unexpected, for those moments of joy that had once seemed so elusive. The father, too, found himself embracing the quieter moments of the day, enjoying the stability that a little order brought to their lives. Their home, once a whirlwind of activity, now felt more like a place of harmony, loud and lively at times, but with an underlying rhythm that brought peace. And in those quieter moments, when the house was still and the children were tucked in bed, both families found themselves reflecting on how far they had come. What had begun as a simple act of kindness, shared afternoon in the rain, had evolved into something deeper. The walls that had once separated them, built from assumptions and misunderstandings, were now slowly being replaced by a bridge. It wasn't a perfect bridge. It was still under construction, still fragile in some places. But the foundation was strong, built on the willingness to see one another for who they truly were, not through the lens of judgment, but through the eyes of understanding. One afternoon, as the sun hung low in the sky, the two families once again found themselves together in the park. The children ran and played, their laughter echoing through the air, while the parents sat on the grass, speaking softly of the things that mattered to them. The conversation was no longer strained, no longer hesitant. There was a comfort now, in their shared presence, an ease that had not been there before. The fathers spoke of their work, of the projects that occupied their days, while the mothers shared stories of their children, their hopes, their challenges. It was a conversation that flowed, not from obligation, but from a genuine desire to connect. And in that conversation, the first family's father found himself speaking about something he had never shared before: the pressure he had always felt to maintain control, to keep everything in order. It was a weight he had carried for years, but as he spoke, he realized that he no longer felt burdened by it. The second family's father, in turn, shared his own struggles with letting go, with the fear that freedom could become chaos. And as they spoke, they saw each other not as neighbors, not as strangers, but as two people who had learned from each other, who had discovered the value in both order and freedom. The mothers, too, found themselves speaking more openly, their conversation weaving in and out like the threads of a tapestry, each word adding to the growing understanding between them. They spoke of their children, of their hopes for the future, of the lessons they had learned along the way. There was no judgment now, no sense of superiority or inferiority, just two women sharing their stories and learning from each other's experiences. Both families sat in comfortable silence, the weight of the day gently lifting from their shoulders. The park, now bathed in the soft light of evening, seemed to hold its breath, as if acknowledging the quiet shift that had taken place. The families, once so divided, now sat together, content, peaceful, and, for the first time, truly connected. The evening stretched on, and as they parted ways, each family felt the quiet bond that had formed between them. It wasn't a bond forged in grand gestures or dramatic moments. It was the kind of bond that grows slowly, over time, through small acts of kindness, through the willingness to see each other not as opposites, but as equals. The first family no longer saw the second as chaotic and disorganized, and the second no longer saw the first as rigid and controlling. They saw each other as human, as individuals with strengths and weaknesses, with joys and sorrows. And in that quiet understanding, the divide between them had finally been bridged not with grand declarations, but with the quiet, steady rhythm of shared life, of learning, of growing together. The two families were no longer just neighbors. They were connected by something deeper, something that would continue to grow as long as they remained willing to listen, to understand, and to be present with each other. The city around them hummed with life. But for now, in this moment, there was only peace-soft, quiet, enduring. As the seasons continued to change, the bond between the two families deepened in ways neither of them expected. It wasn't the big gestures or dramatic moments that brought them closer. It was the small, seemingly insignificant exchanges that wove their lives together, creating a rich tapestry of shared experience. Each day felt like another thread in the growing bond between them, one that could not be seen at first glance, but was undeniably present, like a quiet undercurrent running through their lives on a crisp autumn afternoon. As the leaves began to turn gold and amber, the families once again found themselves in the park. This time, the visit was unplanned, a simple walk that soon turned into a shared picnic. The children ran ahead, their laughter bright and carefree, while the parents settled on a blanket under the trees. The first family's father, once so focused on maintaining control, was now content to simply sit and watch the world unfold around him. The second family's father, usually so laid back, found himself appreciating the quiet moments, the stillness of the park, the sound of the wind rustling through the trees. The food, though simple, was shared with laughter and ease. There was no tension, no sense of formality, just the comfort of being in each other's company, of letting go of the small barriers that had once kept them apart. The first family's mother, who had once viewed the second family's carefree approach to life with skepticism, now found herself enjoying the spontaneous conversations that flowed naturally between them. The second family's mother, who had once feared that too much structure would suffocate her family's spirit, now saw the value in the balance between order and freedom. Both women had learned to appreciate the beauty of the other's world, understanding that neither approach was inherently right or wrong, but that both had something valuable to offer. As the children played, the fathers spoke more openly about their lives, about their childhoods, their hopes for their children, and the challenges they faced as parents. They shared stories of their pasts, of the mistakes they had made, and the lessons they had learned. The conversation was honest, unguarded, and full of vulnerability. It was the kind of conversation that had once felt impossible, but now it seemed natural, a result of the quiet trust they had built between them. The walls that had once divided them were now all but gone, replaced by a foundation of mutual respect and understanding. The day passed slowly, without urgency or expectation. The sun began to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows across the park. The air grew cooler, but the warmth between the families was undeniable. As they said their goodbyes, there was a sense of something unspoken between them, a shared acknowledgement that this last connection was something worth nurturing. The walk home felt different, as if the city had become a little smaller, a little more intimate. The families moved through the streets, side by side, but not in silence. There was no need for words to fill the space between them. Simply being together was enough. The first family's children, who had once been so careful in their play, now ran ahead, their laughter mingling with the sound of the second family's children as they followed. The parents, once so focused on the structure of their lives, now walked at a slower pace, their footsteps in sync, their hearts a little lighter as the families approached their homes. The night seemed quieter than usual, as though the world itself was holding its breath. The familiar hum of the city, the bustle of cars and people had softened, and in its place was a peaceful stillness. The streets seemed to glow with a quiet kind of warmth, not from the streetlights, but from the connection that now existed between these two families. It wasn't perfect, and it wasn't easy, but in this moment there was peace. The walls that had once separated them had been replaced by a bridge built on understanding, on small acts of kindness, and on the willingness to see each other, not as opposites, but as people with different stories, different needs, and different dreams. It wasn't about finding a perfect balance between structure and freedom. It was about accepting that both could exist together. There was no need for grand words, no need for promises of change. They had already changed, subtly but profoundly. The connection between them was real, built on the simple, quiet moments they had shared. And as the night wrapped its arms around the city, they went inside, carrying the warmth of the day with them, a warmth that would continue to glow softly in their hearts, in the quiet of their homes. Each family reflected on the journey they had taken, on the ways they had grown, not just as individuals, but as neighbors, as part of a community. The divide that had once felt so insurmountable now seemed like a distant memory. They had crossed it, not with grand gestures, but with small steps, with shared moments of understanding. And in that understanding, they had found something even more valuable, a sense of belonging, a sense of home. And so, the city, always moving, always changing, continued on. But for the two families, it felt different, no softer, more connected. They had learned that, even in the busy, chaotic rhythm of life, there was space for quiet moments, for shared laughter, for the slow, steady beat of understanding. And in that beat, they found the true heart of the city, beating softly but steadily, like a gentle whisper that said, "We are here together." The weeks rolled by, and the two families found their routines subtly altered, shaped by the small but profound shifts in their relationship. Though the pace of the city remained as fast and unyielding as ever, there was a quiet understanding that had taken root between them, a shared recognition that the space between them was no longer filled with judgment or misunderstanding. It had been replaced by something warmer, something more human. It was not a dramatic change, nor was it something that could be seen in an instant. It was more like a slow unfolding, a delicate transformation that felt like a soft thread weaving its way through the fabric of their lives. They didn't need grand gestures to show that they had learned from each other. Their connection was in the small, everyday moments. Sexed changes over the fence fell from the trees. The two families found themselves once again together, this time at a community event. It was a simple gathering, a local fair celebrating the harvest, with games, food stalls, and the sounds of children's laughter filling the air. The event was modest, but there was a feeling of togetherness, of shared purpose, as neighbors came together to celebrate the changing of the seasons. The first family, though once hesitant to embrace such an open, communal event, found themselves drawn into the atmosphere of it. The children, who had once been so focused on their own structure and routines, now ran around, taking part in the games with the second family's children. The laughter that had once been so carefully restrained now bubbled forth, free and unrestrained, as they joined together in the simple joy of the day. The parents, too, found themselves talking, not just about their children, but about their own lives, their hopes, and their dreams. They shared stories that once felt too personal, too private, but now, in this space of shared experience, it felt natural to open up. The second family's mother, who had once seen her neighbors as distant and rigid, found herself listening with genuine interest as the first family's mother spoke about her childhood, about the things that had shaped her life. She realized that, despite their differences, they had more in common than she had ever imagined. The fathers, too, found common ground. The first family's father, who had once been so stern and unbending, now laughed freely, talking about his experiences with work and life, sharing moments of vulnerability that had once been locked away. The second family's father, who had always valued freedom, now saw the beauty in the way the first family embraced responsibility, realizing that there was strength in structure as well as in spontaneity. By the time the sun began to set, casting long shadows over the fair, both families sat together on a bench, the children resting by their sides, their cheeks flushed with the warmth of the day. The quiet satisfaction of shared experiences settled over them like a warm blanket. The divide between them, once so wide, had shrunk so much that it was almost imperceptible now. What remained was a feeling of connection, a sense of community that had been born out of simple, shared moments. As they gathered their things and prepared to leave, there was no longer any awkwardness between them, no longer any unspoken judgments or expectations. Instead, there was only the soft understanding that they had come together, that their lives, once lived in parallel, had now intertwined in ways that were meaningful, real. They were no longer just neighbors. They were friends who had learned from each other, who had shared in each other's worlds and seen them for what they truly were. And as they said their goodbyes and headed home, the quiet peace of the evening settled over them. The world around them continued its busy hum, the city pressing forward, but they walked slowly, the streets now feeling just a little softer, just a little more familiar. The warmth of their connection was a quiet light in the night, a reminder that even in the busiest of cities, even in the loudest of lives, there is space for peace, for understanding, for the shared moments that bring us together. In the weeks and months that followed, the two families continued to grow closer, sharing more moments, more meals, more quiet conversations. The connection between them, once tentative, had become a quiet force in their lives, an invisible thread binding them together. And though the city around them continued to rush, the two families found peace in the spaces between, in the quiet understanding that had taken root in their hearts. As the old street lamp glowed softly on the corner, a new light had emerged, light that shone not in the glow of a single lamp, but in the shared hearts of those who had learned, step by step, to see each other. It was a light that would continue to shine, quietly enduring, as long as they remained open to each other. As the seasons continued to shift and the city moved through its natural rhythms, something unspoken had settled between the two families, a sense of mutual respect that no longer needed to be declared aloud. The change wasn't marked by grand gestures or visible transformations, but in the little details that began to fill the spaces between them: a knowing glance, a shared moment of laughter, a subtle kindness offered without expectation. The quiet bond that had developed between the two families was evident in the smallest interactions when the children played together. Their laughter no longer felt forced or awkward. It was genuine, the kind of joy that comes from freely shared moments, from the ease of knowing that you belong. The first family's children, once so cautious, had begun to embrace the spontaneity they had once avoided. The second family's children, too, had learned the beauty of structure, of balance, and now they shared it with a sense of gratitude. The parents, too, had changed. They no longer saw each other through the lens of judgment. There were no longer assumptions about what the other family valued or how they lived. Instead, there was understanding, quiet, gentle understanding. They didn't always agree on everything, but they had learned to listen, to respect the differences that made each of their families unique. They had come to realize that the values they held so strongly didn't need to be a point of contention. Rather, they were pieces of a larger whole, each family offering something that the other could learn from, something that could enrich their lives. One evening, as the city began to settle into the quiet of dusk, the two families found themselves together once more. It wasn't planned. It never was anymore. They had simply fallen into this rhythm, these moments of shared time that had become a natural part of their lives. The park, which had once been a neutral ground, now felt like a familiar space, comfortable, warm, and full of memories of laughter and companionship. The children ran ahead, their energy still boundless, while the parents followed at a leisurely pace, their steps synchronized in quiet harmony as they walked through the park. The first family's mother turned to the second family's mother, her smile warm but full of thought. "I've been thinking," she began, her voice soft, "about how much we've changed, not just as families, but as people. I never imagined I'd find so much peace in letting go of some of my expectations." The second family's mother nodded, a knowing look in her eyes. "I feel the same way. I used to think that letting go of structure meant losing control. But now I see it differently. It's not about control. It's about trusting the space between, trusting that things can unfold without being forced." Their words hung in the air, quiet yet profound. It wasn't just about letting go or finding balance. It was about trusting each other, trusting that their differences didn't need to divide them, but could instead create a new foundation for connection. The space between them, once filled with judgment and misunderstanding, was now filled with understanding, with the quiet embrace of shared humanity. The fathers, walking slightly ahead, exchanged a glance. They had seen this transformation to shift in their families, in their hearts. The first family's father, once so determined to keep things in their neat, orderly place, now found himself embracing the unpredictability of life with less fear. The second family's father, once skeptical of structure, had come to understand its value, not as a cage, but as a framework for growth. They reached the center of the park, where a large fountain bubbled quietly in the middle of a circular stone basin. The children were already gathered around it, tossing small stones into the water, watching them create ripples that spread across the surface. It was a simple scene, but it felt significant. These small, fleeting moments of connection, these quiet actions that would soon fade into memory, but would forever be a part of the shared tapestry of their lives. The two families gathered around the fountain, the night growing cooler as the sky turned darker. They didn't need to say much. The silence between them was not awkward. It was comfortable, filled with the knowledge that they had come a long way together. The space between them was no longer a divide, but a bridge that allowed them to cross from one side to the other with ease. The first family's father placed a hand on the second family's father's shoulder. "I'm glad we did this," he said, his voice soft but sincere. The second family's father smiled, his gaze meeting the other man's with quiet understanding. "Me too." And in that quiet moment, standing together by the fountain, the two families felt the weight of their shared journey. It hadn't been easy. There had been misunderstandings, moments of frustration, but through it all, they had learned. They had learned to let go of judgment, to embrace the differences that once seemed insurmountable, and to create something new, a bond built not on similarities, but on a deep and lasting respect for each other's unique ways of being. As they left the park, the city lights flickering softly in the distance, the families walked side by side, their hearts lighter than they had been when they first met. They knew that life would continue to move forward, that challenges would come, but in that moment, they also knew that they had built something stronger than any different something that would endure in the spaces between them, in the quiet moments that would always be theirs to share. The city continued to hum with its usual rhythm, but for the two families there was a new beat, a quiet pulse of connection, of understanding, and of peace. And as they walked home, side by side, they knew that they had found something more than just proximity. They had found a true connection, one that was built on time, patience, and the willingness to meet each other in the spaces where they could truly see each other. As the months passed, the two families continued to move forward in this new rhythm they had created together. Their connection, built on understanding and shared experiences, deepened in ways that were often subtle but profoundly felt. The once rigid boundaries between them had long since faded, leaving only the quiet, unspoken bond of mutual respect and warmth. It wasn't perfection. They still had moments of friction, still carried remnants of their past misunderstandings, but now there was something different in the way they approached each other. They were no longer just neighbors. They had become part of each other's lives in ways they hadn't expected, offering support in moments of need, celebrating each other's small victories, and learning to embrace the differences that had once divided them. One evening, after a long day, the first family's father found himself sitting on the porch, watching the sun dip below the horizon. The world around him felt peaceful, the soft glow of twilight casting a warm light over the street. His thoughts were quiet, reflective. He thought back to the time when he had been so certain of his ways, so unwilling to step outside the structure he had built for his family. He had been afraid that anything outside the routine, outside the expectations, would unravel everything he had worked so hard to create. But now, sitting in the quiet of the evening, he realized that the structure he had so carefully maintained had never been the true source of strength. It was the ability to open up, to listen, to allow the unexpected to happen that had created the true foundation for his family's happiness. A soft voice broke his reverie. His wife came out to join him, a gentle smile on her face. She sat beside him, and together they watched the sky darken. "You've been quiet lately," she said, her voice warm and curious. "Is something on your mind?" He turned to her, his eyes thoughtful, and for a moment he said nothing. Instead, he let the quiet stretch between them, the comfortable silence that had become so familiar. After a beat, he spoke softly, his voice filled with a quiet understanding. "I've been thinking about how much we've changed, how much I've changed, and how much that's been because of them, because of the second family. We've learned so much from them, haven't we?" She nodded, her smile growing wider. "Yes, I think we have. You know," he continued, his voice calm, "I thought I had everything figured out, but I was wrong. There's a strength in flexibility, in allowing the unexpected to shape you. There's a strength in understanding, in letting go of the idea that everything has to be perfect. I've realized that our family, our life, can still have structure and still have room for freedom." The first family's mother turned her gaze toward the house across the street where the second family lived. She thought about how much their way of life had once seemed chaotic to her, how their freedom had felt like an intrusion on the order she so carefully kept. The second family had shown her that there was beauty in the untamed, that life didn't have to be perfectly planned to be meaningful. They had taught her to value the moments in between, those small, unscripted exchanges that often held the most truth. She looked back at her husband, her heart full of gratitude. We've learned a lot from them, and I think, in some ways, they've learned from us, too. He smiled, his hand reaching out to gently take hers. Yes, he agreed, we've helped each other, not by changing each other, but by accepting each other. And that's made all the difference. The quiet of the evening deepened, the city now bathed in the soft glow of the streetlights. They sat there for a while, simply enjoying the peace of the moment, the warmth of their shared understanding. As the days continued to unfold, the two families continued to come together, sometimes in planned gatherings, sometimes by chance, but always with a sense of belonging. The connection between them had become something deeper than friendship. It was a kind of partnership, built on trust, respect, and the quiet recognition that they each had something valuable to offer. And in time, this partnership began to ripple out, affecting the neighborhood. Others in the community, who had once kept to themselves, began to open up, to share their lives in small ways. The lessons of the two families of acceptance, of quiet understanding, of the strength that comes from embracing differences, began to spread like a gentle tide that lifted everything in its path. One evening, as the first family's father walked down the street, he passed by a few of their neighbors, people he had once exchanged only polite pleasantries with. This time, however, their greetings were warmer. Their smiles lingered a little longer, and their words were filled with a kindness that felt genuine. It wasn't just the first family that had changed. The entire community had begun to shift, slowly but surely, under the influence of the quiet bond that had been formed between the two families. The city, once filled with the noise of busy lives and isolated souls, now felt a little smaller, a little more connected. It wasn't perfect, it wasn't some utopian dream, but it was real. The change, quiet as it was, had made the world feel like a place where connection was possible, where understanding could thrive, even in a place as bustling and busy as this one. As the first family's father reached his door, he paused for a moment, taking in the soft glow of the streetlights, the sound of laughter in the distance. The night had fallen, but there was a quiet light in the city, one that came not from the artificial lamps that lit the streets, but from the shared warmth of connection, of people coming together, piece by piece, in the quiet spaces between. And as he stepped inside, closing the door behind him, he felt at peace, knowing that the quiet light of understanding would continue to shine, no matter what the future held. The days turned into weeks, and the weeks into months, but the changes between the two families had taken root so deeply that it felt as though they had always been this way. The once awkward silences were now filled with laughter, and the moments of hesitation had been replaced by natural, flowing conversations. The structure of their lives had shifted not dramatically, but enough that each day felt more connected, more meaningful. The first family had embraced a gentler rhythm to life, one that included the flexibility and spontaneity they had once looked at with skepticism. They still had their routines, their moments of order, but they had learned to leave space for the unplanned, the messy, and the unexpected. And in doing so, they discovered something unexpected themselves, the joy that came from letting go of perfection. The father, once so focused on maintaining control, now found peace in the quiet moments of unpredictability. The mother, who had once clung to tradition with a firm hand, now laughed more freely, reveling in the chaos of the present. Even if it was messy at times, the second family had found balance, too. Their once structured life now included moments of discipline, of routine that provided their children with the sense of security they had not realized they needed. The father, who had always shunned the rigidity of structure, now appreciated the sense of calm that came with it. He recognized that order did not stifle creativity, but rather allowed space for it to flourish. The mother, too, had grown, finding that the strength of structure could coexist with the freedom she valued. They had become a little more like the first family, and the first family had become a little more like them. And in that balance, they found something harmonious, a quiet understanding that had been born from their willingness to step outside of their comfort zones. The two families, once living side by side with a wall of judgment between them, had now become something more. They had grown into a partnership, one that was founded not on sameness, but on a recognition of their differences and a shared commitment to respect and understanding. Their children had learned from each other, the first family's children, embracing the spontaneity of life, while the second family's children had discovered the value of routine and responsibility. They had all learned the most important lesson of all, that life was richer, fuller, when shared with others, when seen through a lens of compassion and openness. One evening, as the golden hues of dusk began to settle over the city, the two families gathered together once more. It was not for a grand occasion, but for the simple joy of being together. The park, where they had spent so many quiet afternoons, seemed to glow with a quiet warmth. The air was cool, the sun dipping low, casting long shadows over the grass. The children, as always, were running and laughing, their voices a melody that floated on the evening breeze. The parents sat together, their conversation flowing easily. Between them, filled with small stories and shared memories, the first family's father spoke of the small moments he now cherished, moments that once would have passed unnoticed. The second family's father shared his newfound appreciation for the structure that had once seemed so foreign to him. The mothers exchanged smiles, knowing how far they had come from their first awkward encounters, from the judgments and misunderstandings to this place of genuine connection. As the evening wore on and the stars began to appear in the sky, the families found themselves gathered in a quiet circle, the gentle hum of the city around them fading into the background. The children, tired from their play, sat at their parents' feet, their eyes heavy with sleep, content in the warmth of the moment. The two families, once strangers in many ways, were now intertwined, connected not by blood, but by shared experience, by the willingness to understand and accept each other. The first family's father looked around at the faces of the people he had once only seen as neighbors, and a quiet smile spread across his face. He had learned so much, not just from the second family, but from the experience of learning to open his heart, to let go of the rigid walls he had built around his life. The second family's mother, too, looked around, feeling a sense of gratitude for the changes that had come, for the unexpected way her life had intertwined with the first family's. And as the night deepened and the last traces of daylight faded, they sat in silence, comfortable, at peace, and together. It was a silence that was no longer heavy with judgment or regret. It was a silence filled with the quiet understanding that had grown between them over time. There were no words needed. They had arrived at this place together, slowly, steadily. Through small moments of openness and connection, the city, with all its noise and motion, continued to hum in the background. But in this moment, it felt distant. The world around them was full of movement, of life. But for these two families, the world was as it should, be quiet, peaceful, and full of possibility. The divide that had once separated them was now a memory, replaced by the soft glow of shared humanity. And so, in the quiet of the evening, they sat to families who had once been strangers, now bound by the quiet strength of understanding. And in the glow of the streetlights, the soft murmur of the city, they realized that the greatest gift they had found was not in their differences, but in the simple, quiet moments of connection that they had learned to share. Together, they had built a bridge that would stand not in the loud, attention-grabbing way of the world, but in the quiet, enduring way of hearts that had learned to understand, to accept, and to be together.